This is the Marketing Podcast Network.
Welcome to Uncorking a Story, the podcast that introduces you to the rich world of storytellers who share their personal journeys, creative processes, and the stories behind their stories, one conversation at a time. I'm your host, Mike Carlon, and I'm thrilled to be part of your writing journey. If you're an aspiring writer, a literary enthusiast, or simply someone who believes in the transformative power of words, you've come to the right place. Every week, we'll pop the cork on the world of successful storytellers and give you a healthy pour of inspiration, insight, and empowerment. My mission is to help writers like you realize your full potential through the transformative and therapeutic power of writing. Whether you're just starting your literary voyage or looking to refine your craft, I'm here to provide you with the knowledge, inspiration, and encouragement you need to embark on your own storytelling adventure. So, are you ready to uncork your story and let your creativity flow? Uncorking a Story is about to begin. Sit back, relax, and let the transformative magic of storytelling whisk you away. Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Doctor and author Robin Cook is widely credited with introducing the word medical to the thriller genre, and decades after the publication of his 1977 breakthrough novel Coma, he continues to dominate the category he created. Cook has successfully combined medical fact with fiction to produce 39 international bestsellers, including Outbreak, Terminal, Contagion, Chromosome 6, Foreign Body, Intervention, and Cure. He joins me today on Uncorking a Story to talk about his career and latest novel, Bellevue. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Dr. Robin Cook.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Excited to have you here. I'm a big fan for a long time, but I always like to start these in the beginning. So, Dr. Cook, tell me, where does your story as an author begin?
That's probably a very interesting question, and I probably have an answer a little different from everyone else. And because I wrote my first book on a nuclear submarine. And I can't imagine that too many other people have done that. And yet I credit the United States Navy with having provided me the opportunity. I had said way back when I was in medical school that I said, someday I'm going to write a book about the way medicine is really going, and where the direction it's going in, because part of the reason that I went into medicine in the first place was that I had read a number of novels about medicine and doctors, and of course then I'd seen some movies about being doctors, and I had a feeling that they all weren't very accurate, and that someone should write about medicine as it really is, rather than as people would like it to be or think it is. And the trouble is that it's difficult to do that unless you are in medicine and you've experienced what it's like. You can read about it, you can ask people, you can study, but somehow it's one of those experiences that I believe you really have to experience yourself in order to be able to describe it well. And but you know, when I was in medical school, I had no time to even think of writing anything. I was barely keeping my head above water because I was actually putting myself through medical school, which meant I was working at night and going to medical school in the daytime. And so there was no chance to write. And then once you graduate, it's like going from the frying pan into the fire. You're even busier. You're the first year resident, which is what they call it now. Back when I did it, it was called internship. And it was decided that it was so bad that they were going to get rid of it. But all they did was change the name. So it's the same experience. It's just called first year residency rather than internship. So I didn't have time to write anything. And it wasn't until I had finished my residency, at least my first residency, that, and I got drafted because Vietnam was heating up in the mid-60s. I was drafted, and by a number of different strange set of circumstances, I ended up in a nuclear submarine. And we went underwater, and we were underwater for 75 days or so. And so I wrote my first book underwater.
So you had had a little bit more free time in the Navy underwater than you did as an intern.
Well, when you're in the Navy and you're on a submarine like that, you can stand a watch. That's what they call it. And it's usually an 8-hour shift. And but then once you finish that, if you're lucky, and I was pretty lucky, I could sleep for 8 hours. But then there's still another 8 hours to go. And so that's when I said to myself, you said someday you were going to write a book. So here's your opportunity. Do it. And I was lucky because I had my own office on the submarine. And so I started writing this book, and I, in a lot of ways, because I was a chemistry, math, physics major in college, I didn't take any of those courses that would have made me a better writer, maybe even a better person. The humanities courses, the literature, the writing, etc. I actually actively stayed away from those courses because to go to medical school, I had to get all very good grades. And I was afraid to take those courses because the grading system is subjective. And I need, if you take science, either you know it or you don't know it. And if you don't know it, you study more until you know it, and then you can get a decent grade. But there's no guarantee in those other kinds of courses. So unfortunately, I went to a very good liberal arts school and didn't take any liberal arts.
Was the book you were writing on that sub, was that what became Coma, or was it a different manuscript?
That was a different manuscript. That was the first book I wrote we called it because my title, I made up a word for the title, and they said, absolutely not, the publisher. So it was called The Year of the Intern. And unfortunately, it was lucky that it got published because I knew so little about publishing that I didn't even know it was difficult to get a book published. And which is probably good, because had I known, maybe I wouldn't have tried. Because you think, well, if you spend all that time writing a book and whatnot, and then it doesn't get published, have you really accomplished anything? Actually, I think you do. In other words, I actually advise people who might ask me, I said, if you want to know yourself a little bit better, writing a book is really a good way to do it. And so that if that is enough feedback and enough benefit, then go ahead and try. If you only want to do it if you are sure it's going to get published, the chances of that are pretty slim, unless you're somehow a famous person or you've done something famous or that sort of thing. But especially a fiction book. But it's I've really enjoyed. Well, I don't know whether enjoy is the right word. Maybe it is. I mean, I'm writing my 42nd book right now, and I'm very much involved in it every day. My characters wake me up, and so it's been a very rewarding experience for me in so many levels. I feel very lucky that I have the benefit. or I mean, I have to give the credit to my readers, because if I didn't have my readers, I wouldn't be a writer. And
My story with you begins probably 30, 40 years ago, maybe even more. My grandfather was a doctor. He was a World War II field surgeon. And I remember growing up in his study, he had a ton of books. You know, he had the physician's desk reference on one side, a bunch of fiction on the other. One of them was this book called Coma. And I remember as a kid, I'm like, well, that looks really interesting. And I remember reading it, and I was like, wow, this is fascinating. When I was younger, I wanted to be a doctor. And then I fast forward, I don't know, 10 or so years, well, probably more than 10 years. I was married. My wife gives me a copy of Contagion. And I knew it had to be a good book because she's not a reader. And she told me that I wouldn't be able to put that book down. And that's when I got introduced to Jack Stapleton, Laurie Montgomery, and I
Hmm.
just devoured everything that came after that. So I personally want to thank you for bringing those, bringing those characters to life, because I love them so much. But
Well, thank you. Yeah, I enjoy. In fact, the book that I'm writing right now is Jack and Laurie book.
yeah,
And it's a little bit different because they've sent their kids off. You know, I've written 14, I think it's 14 books about them, and I've carried them through their life. And now they actually have children. Of course, the children had to have problems, and so I feel sorry for them in that regard. But anyway, they've sent their kids off to camp. It's in the middle of the summer, and they get invited up to a mythical small town in upstate New York. And that's where they are right now. And
interesting. Well, I can't wait to find out what happens next, because I'm sure it's not a relaxing vacation for them by any
well,
stretch of the
they're
imagination.
thinking it is, but that's changing, and you as the reader know what's going on. So it's one of those books. Thrillers can. I write what I call mystery thrillers, and the reason is it's a way to keep the reader interested. It also keeps me interested. And there's sort of two ways of doing that in terms of thrillers. One is to have some sort of a mystery, so that propels the reader, and it propels me as the writer, because I like to think about how I would solve this mystery, et cetera, et cetera. The other way is to the violation of the safe haven concept, where the reader knows something that the main character doesn't know. And the main character then blindly, you say, don't go there. Don't go. And so that's the mechanism that I'm using in this book in particular.
Yeah, that's great. It's what I always appreciated about Columbo episodes, where we as the audience knew kind of who did what in the first 5 minutes, and then it was watching, Peter Falk figure it out, which was
Yeah.
was the fun part of it. Not an exact comparison, but
Well, no, very similar though. The same
yeah,
concept, actually. Yes,
yeah.
you're right. I remember those as well.
At what point did you stop practicing medicine to focus on writing full time, or did that never happen?
It really never happened. I did all my writing really at night until now. Um, and even Coma, I was still a resident. I was back, still a resident. I I did a second residency, I changed specialties. And so I went started from the beginning again. And it was in the last time of that residency that I was writing Coma at night. Um, Luckily, that was a residency that was not quite as demanding as my first residency.
Did having fame or notoriety as an author impact the relationships you had, with either your patients or your colleagues in the medical community?
Um, Probably minimally. Um, it's an interesting question. Um, I think probably a handful of patients might have come to me because they had heard that I was a writer or that they had read my book and whatnot. But otherwise, I really kind of separated the two, really, even in, particularly in my mind as well. And and actually, I felt that they went together in a strange sort of way. Um, that I think that being a writer, in a certain sense, made me a better doctor. Because being a writer, you have to constantly be thinking about characters and characterizations, et cetera. So I became even more kind of interested in my patients in a way that the medical school tried to teach me. In other words, how the importance of the history and really getting to know a person, et cetera. And having to come up with characters on a regular basis, I think it made me more sensitive to my patients' characters, and yet the experiences in medicine also contributed to me having kind of a reservoir of experiences that I could draw from my writing. So, in a way, that the two professions, so to speak, kind of helped each other.
Well, I think one of the keys of being a good writer is being a very curious person, because you want to follow your nose and your imagination. You want to get inside the minds of your characters, build a sense of empathy for them, for the reader. And I want a doctor personally who's very curious, because if I'm going to somebody and I have some kind of a problem, I want them to wonder really kind of what's at the center of it. Not just treat the symptom, but really get it to the heart of the matter. And it sounds like, that curiosity, that you had as a writer definitely translated to your practicing in medicine.
Yes, yeah, I believe so. I believe so. But actually, I kept them pretty darn separate.
Yeah.
Um, in being a doctor, I was Robert B. Cook, and being a writer, I was Robin Cook, and it was almost as if the twain did not meet.
Yeah. It's like Clark Kent taking the glasses off and becoming Superman, right? Just a small change in a couple letters, and it was different. Well, I know you've got a new book coming out called Bellevue. What can you share with us about this new one?
Well, I a real excitement, and I hope it gets translated into my readers liking it as much as I think they will. You know, when I wrote Coma, I was really convinced I had written something quite unique, um, because it was the first time that I combined, or it was combined, sort of a medical mystery thriller in that it had accurate medical, and yet it also had the usual kind of thriller aspects. Um, so it was kind of a unique combination, and it proved to be the case that people really found it interesting because they could tell that the way that I had portrayed the hospital was very accurate, and um, I have a very similar feeling for this book after, Coma was my second book. This is my 41st. So it's like 40 books have taken me to go from Coma to this one. Um, but this book has, again, it could only be written by someone, I believe it can only be written by someone who actually had been a surgical resident. In other words, the character is a surgical resident. And he's a first-year surgical resident. So, and not only is he a first year, he's a first days. It's only about the first few days of his surgical residency. So it's very accurate in that regard. You really feel like you're this person. You feel the tension, the concern. You know, what happens is that you go through medical school and then suddenly the next day you're a doctor. And suddenly you go from always having other people around, residents and et cetera, and attendings, and you're a medical student. Suddenly, when you're the resident, the first year resident, the first night you're on call, you feel like you're the only one in the world. And it's such a strange set of circumstances. So I've described this in a way, and that's very accurate. And the surgical information, this guy is learning surgery. He doesn't really know any surgery. So he's learning it. So the reader's learning it in the same time. So it's very accurate, again, in this kind of medical scientific stuff. But what happens in this book is that the book moves into something I've never done before. I've never used the supernatural. And this book moves into the supernatural. And the reason I did that is because I thought it was the only way that I could tell this story. And the story is about trying to give credit to patients for the development of medicine. You know, the medical profession takes all the credit. You know, this doctor did this doctor did that, this hospital did this. But if it weren't for the patients who suffered through all this, none of it would have happened. And so this was a way of writing a story that's going to temper the contributions of doctors and elevate the contributions of patients for the history of medicine. And so it uses the supernatural. And the other reason that it uses the supernatural, which is interesting, is because it's about this iconic hospital called Bellevue, which is arguably the oldest hospital in the United States. There's some disagreement that maybe a hospital in Philadelphia is a little tiny bit older, but nonetheless, it is. And it's a full service hospital. It's a huge hospital. At times it had thousands of beds. And it has all the divisions of a hospital, including that it had a psychiatric hospital. And in fact, the psychiatric hospital became so famous because of the patients that were in it, that a lot of people think that the Bellevue Hospital is synonymous with a psychiatric institute rather than a full-service hospital. It's really a full-service hospital. A lot of firsts in medicine happened at Bellevue, but it was a very important psychiatric hospital. And they built their own hospital. The psychiatrists finally built their own hospital, and it opened in the beginning of the previous century. Not the beginning. I think it was actually, I don't think it opened until 1934 or 33 or something like that. And all the patients eventually were moved out of that hospital. The last patients were moved out in the mid-'80s, 1980s, when the high-rise Bellevue Hospital was built. They broke down, demolished the old hospital, which I actually spent time in as a sub-intern. And they moved all the patients out. But you know, strangely enough, that building, a 600-bed hospital, still stands in New York on the corner of First Avenue and 30th Street. And the reason I kept looking at it was because it's right next to the office of the chief medical examiner, which is what I've used in all my Jack and Laurie stories. So I was looking at this hospital many, many times, wondering why it's still there and empty. And I thought, it's got to be a haunted house in the middle of New York. And so that's really how I started thinking about this novel, Bellevue, and how I thought I could use that to talk about and develop and get people to understand some of the great discoveries in medicine that happened at Bellevue. And so it's for me, it seems just the opposite, because it has this supernatural element, very important supernatural element, and yet has never been in any of my novels before. So in a way, the way Coma was unique, this novel Bellevue is unique. And I just can't wait to hear whether my readers like it or don't like it.
Well, I'm sure they will be vocal about it one way or the other. I think the market, so to speak, is good like that. You mentioned just that 40 over 40 books, 42 books. And what I love about your description of Bellevue is you're not afraid to sort of challenge what it is that you do. Just by sort of putting in a supernatural component. It seems like you're always evolving as an author. You're not doing the cookie cutter type thing and churning out the same books over and over again.
No, I don't think so. But I've been accused of that a few times, and because my books are almost all of them are medically oriented, and my third book wasn't. I wrote a book about archaeology and Egyptology, actually, just to kind of prove to myself, am I using medicine as a crutch? Can I actually write a book that's not about medicine? So that was sort of a challenge for myself. But otherwise, I feel like I am the sole person in this country who benefits from the fact that we have such a weird healthcare system. Because so many of my books deal with issues that are reflective of our healthcare system. So I feel like I'm never going to run out of subject matter.
Yeah.
And especially nowadays with what seems to be some new challenges to medicine in this country, the questioning of the scientific method even. Well,
we can leave it there. We can leave it at that. One last thing I'm just curious about, since you've had such a long career, but between the Year of the Intern, Coma, all the way up to Bellevue, and the next book that you're writing, how have you seen, or what are the biggest changes you've noticed in the publishing industry over that time period?
The biggest change I've noticed is that with the introduction of our phones, et cetera, a lot of people aren't reading very much, which I think is too bad. And when I first started doing this in the late 70s and early 80s, people read a lot. I can remember going out on a publicity tour. We used to do publicity tours back then, and especially in the beginning, I would do, maybe as many as 20 to 30 cities, and that meant getting on a plane every day and flying to the next city. And I can actually remember when I was doing a publicity tour for a book I wrote called Fever. I got on a plane. I believe it was in Philadelphia. And I got on, and I was lucky to get on because I was sort of late, but I got on and I had to walk all the way down the plane to sit way in the back. And it seemed like everyone was reading my book, Fever, which was a very nice feeling. And I thought it was a setup by my publisher. But I think that we as a culture are losing something, and because reading, I've become much more of a reader myself. I have to say that when I was in college and medical school, I didn't read much. I just didn't have the time, and but I've become more of a reader, and I think it's good for everyone, including the person who reads and for the culture.
Yeah.
So that's the biggest change that I've seen is that there's just less reading going on.
I agree. I commute to Manhattan 3 out of 5 days a week. And, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I'd see people reading the newspaper at least, or reading a magazine. Now I just really witness people staring at their phones, watching videos, or even worse, talking to themselves. It looks like they're talking to themselves because they have their wireless headphones in. And I think to myself, these people are talking to themselves. They probably belong in Bellevue.
Well, I think they're missing something really, and yeah, and the phone situation, it's so infectious. You pick it up and you end up looking at the same kind of stuff, and so I'm hoping that each time I do a book, I'm hoping, well, maybe I can entice more people in some way, and to read something that I like to keep people's attention, but I like to make them think about something, um, and think about. Usually, it's thinking about some issue associated with medicine. Um,
So, as we're recording this, tomorrow is December 3rd, which is publication day for Bellevue. I'm curious, what are you doing to celebrate, if anything?
um, Actually, I'm going to be doing a few shows like this, and to me, it's a celebration. And I appreciate you asking questions about it. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it a little bit, because I actually do think this is kind of a special book, and I'm really hoping that I think people will learn something, not only have fun with it, but will learn something by reading it.
Well, I can't wait to dig into it starting tomorrow. And last question I'll have for you is, if you can go back in time and whisper some words of advice, maybe to that younger Robin Cook who's on that nuclear sub, working that 8-hour shift and writing for a bit after that, what would you tell your younger self? What kind of words of advice would your older self offer your younger self?
Huh. I look back on my life and I feel like I've been so lucky. um, I wouldn't want to change anything. I mean, I really do feel I was lucky. I got to go to a great school. I got to go to a great medical school. I made the right decisions about residency, um, and since I had to work in college, I mean, in medical school, I did in college too, but in medical school, I had to work. But you know what that got me? Not only did it get me through medical school, but I worked at night for the open heart surgery team. So I learned stuff that other medical students didn't learn. I slept in the open heart recovery room many nights. And because of that, I got to know the surgeons who were really developing open heart surgery at the time as a medical student. Even the surgical residents didn't get a chance to talk to them. And I was talking to them every night. And then I got asked, because I ran this lab at night for them, and it was a French professor who was my boss. He asked me if I could set up the same lab for Jacques Cousteau in the summer. So I spent my summers in medical school with working with the Cousteau group, which, I mean, I was this destitute medical student. I'm on the Riviera. And it was there that this high-ranking naval officer came to meet Cousteau and see his project, that I met him, and then I helped him a little bit, because I could speak French really well. And he said, if you ever find yourself in the Navy, give me a call. That's how I ended up in the submarine.
Wow. I
called him, and he made it possible for me to become an aquanaut. I became an aquanaut, doing research, diving research during my Navy career. What an opportunity. I've been so lucky. I guess I have to just I have to compliment myself for working.
Yeah.
Always working.
Had you not been drafted and had that opportunity on the nuclear sub, do you think that first book would have ever come out of you?
Probably not, because I would have been caught up in my medical career, which I was. I mean, getting drafted, I got pulled out. I actually tried to get out of it because I applied for another residency after I finished my first residency. And the Navy drafted me, and I said, well, can you give me a deferment again? I was trying to get out of it. But it turned out that no, I couldn't. So I had to go in, and then I made the best of it. And luckily, I took advantage of knowing this high-ranking naval officer and actually taking the risk of calling him up to see if he'd remember me. And he did. And then he pulled strings and got me into his program, which you really were supposed to be a career Navy person to get. And I was not. I was a draftee. I ended up spending extra time in the Navy, but only like an extra 6 to 8 months or something like that.
Yeah. Well, my father always told me, he always said, Michael, life is contacts. And that certainly rings true in your story.
It certainly is. Certainly is.
Well, Dr. Robin Cook, it has been a pleasure speaking with you. And I will say thank you for stopping by Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
Well, I really appreciate it. And in fact, it's before any of my other interviews. And so this will be particularly memorable. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlon uncork a new story.